European leaders meet to discuss Russia and the Ukraine war after a surge in attacks by both sides in September. More sanctions are under discussion and new defenses against Russian drones. So what next for peace efforts? Or are Russia and Europe moving closer to conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. As the leaders of 47 European countries meet in Denmark, there seems little sign of an end to the war in Ukraine. Since U.S. President Donald Trump's meetings with all the parties in August, military activity has surged. Kyiv suffered some of the worst attacks since the war began 3.5 years ago. Ukraine has struck energy targets deep inside Russia, hitting oil refineries and fuel supplies. European nations are on high alert after incursions by Russian drones into their airspace. Unexplained cyber attacks and drones hovering near airports have also increased tension. More sanctions against Russia, including the seizure of frozen assets, are under discussion. Russia says it will hit back against any such move, while blaming some of the drone incursions on Ukraine. So, are Russia and Europe moving closer to conflict? And is peace in Ukraine further away than ever, or can a way be found to end the bloodshed? We'll talk to our guest shortly, but first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
Arriving at the summit in Copenhagen on Thursday, the Ukrainian president's message to dozens of European leaders was clear. Nowhere in Europe is safe from Russia, according to the leader of a country at war with Moscow's forces.
We are all now in a new reality, and everyone, I think, understands this, even those who may not want to admit it yet. The recent drone incidents across Europe are a clear sign that Russia still feels bold enough to escalate this war. And it was never just about Ukraine. Russia has always aimed to break the West and Europe in particular.
Zelenskyy is hoping to rally EU support in Ukraine's fight against Russia. Leaders from just under 50 countries gathered for the summit, discussing how to bolster Europe's defenses, with many on edge after a series of high-profile incursions into European airspace by Russian fighter jets and drones, heightening fears the war could spill across borders. The Danish Prime Minister says Europe is already in a so-called hybrid war with Russia.
Peace with Russia can only be achieved through strength. We have to strengthen Ukraine and weaken Russia with more sanctions. We have to be able to finance the armed forces in Ukraine. All of us have to deliver more weapons, more ammunition, and we have to do it faster. Nowhere it will make a greater impact for European security than at the front lines in Ukraine.
As well as more sanctions, high on the agenda has been a controversial proposal to use frozen Russian assets to finance a $160 billion loan for Kyiv. Agreement has not been reached. Belgium holds most of the assets and is worried about legal action. The European Central Bank is also concerned that seizing Russian assets could undermine the global credibility of the euro. Plans, too, are being discussed for a multi-layered drone wall in Europe to quickly detect and then track and destroy Russian drones.
Every European citizen and every square centimeter in Europe has to be safe. So we must provide the strongest of deterrents at scale and at speed. And that was the focus of our discussions today. There is a clear sense of urgency because preserving peace has always been a core task of the European Union.
Despite the calls for a united front, disagreements remain. Hungary's Viktor Orbán continues to oppose Ukraine's effort to join the European Union, which requires unanimous support among member states to become reality. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Düsseldorf is Mattia Nelles, CEO and co-founder of the German-Ukrainian Bureau, a think tank promoting stronger support for Ukraine. In the Latvian capital, Riga, is Eldar Mamedov, non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and a former Latvian diplomat who also served as a foreign policy advisor in the European Parliament. Joining us from Perth, Australia, is Alexey Muraviev, Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. Welcome to you all. Thanks for your time. Alexey, we'll begin with you. So how is the Kremlin interpreting the rhetoric from the latest EU summit, like talks of a hybrid war and a drone wall?
Well, I mean, there are mixed signals that are coming out of Moscow. Some suggest that the Kremlin's position is, well, the Europeans have once again met, have discussed, all talk, no action. So they kind of adopt wait and see approach. But there are some voices in Russia that suggest that it is still a continuation of the process that may complicate things for the Russians, particularly around the Baltic Sea region, especially if some propositions, for example, on searching or detaining elements of the Russian so-called shadow fleet will be implemented, or if Danish Straits may be shut down or will receive some sort of reinforced policing measures. So I think it's they still trying to figure out what does it mean for them. They trying obviously to put on a brave face and demonstrate, well, it's not going to have any major effect on battlefield conditions, but at the same time, they're also feeling concerned because of vulnerability of the supply chains that they have set up to bypass the sanctions regime.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that point you make about potential miscalculations in a moment. But first, let me get the view from Eldar. So, Eldar, in Copenhagen, much was said about defense, right? Drone walls, cyber resilience, but there was little said about diplomacy. Why do you think that is? And what does that mean then for the future?
Well, that means that European leaders are busy talking about building drone walls or adopting other measures, but they're not talking about what for me is the core issue. And that is the question, under what circumstances the war between Russia and Europe is possible, and then subsequently do everything that would avoid that scenario. And in my opinion, the war is possible under two scenarios. Number one, if there is an escalation in Ukraine, and that escalation will include deliveries of long-range missiles to Ukraine with the capability of deep strikes in Russia, the blockade of Russian ports in the Baltics, deployment of NATO forces in Ukraine. And the second circumstance could be if the current hostility prevailing between Russia and Europe escalates. We've seen drone incursions, violations of airspace, and if in the past one phone call between foreign ministers or defense officials would suffice to tamp that tension down, then in the current febrile atmosphere, any such incident carries potentially high escalatory potential. And that's where the danger is, and European leaders are not discussing that.
Okay, Mattia, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that there's a danger that Europe is heading down this path without a clear political endgame? And when you say that Europe must move from help Ukraine to let Ukraine help us, what do you mean by that?
First of all, thank you for having me. And I would say that from Copenhagen, no one expected decisions to be made. This was an informal leaders summit, so they discussed ways to support Ukraine because the European understanding is more or less unanimous that Ukraine needs to be in a position of strength together with Europe to make the Russians understand that they cannot chip away slowly our European support by undermining our sovereignty with the airspace incursion or other active measures. So first of all, Ukraine can help Europe, and that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a beginning of a paradigm shift. I was in Denmark last week, and shortly after the drone incursion, and what did the Ukrainians do? They sent military personnel to help the Danes understand how to handle drone incursions better. Because let's face it, from drones to military warfare to the defense innovation, Ukraine has a lot to teach us, and Europe better listens and starts to listen quickly.
So are you saying that Ukraine can become a security provider for Europe? And how realistic is that scenario?
Very much. I think that without Ukraine, Europe cannot be secure. Ukraine has one of the largest European armies, and it is at war currently with Russia. But Russia is not just threatening Ukraine, it is threatening the entire European peace order. So Ukraine, as I said, has a lot to offer on the tactical, but also on the strategic level when it comes to experience in fighting war, and also, most importantly, how to avoid it. Because Russia is only likely to escalate this war further if it senses weakness, and Ukraine can help us address and overcome these weaknesses, from drone to naval warfare to aerial combat. They have a lot where we can learn and have to learn.
Alexey, look, these European countries have come together, right? Tens of them, in fact. What calculations do you think Russia is making in response to this perception by some of European political unity?
Well, I mean, the Russians are ready to deploy. Whether it's deploying warships to escort merchant vessels, as they're already doing to some extent, but they may just regularize it and provide escort to every single vessel that is leaving Russian territorial waters. They would also be calculating what exactly can Europeans bring to the table, because one of the problems that I can clearly see that comes out of these meetings with Europe when they talk about, for example, building the so-called drone wall, or talking about potential imposition of no-fly zone over Ukraine, is they come short in discussing assets. They come short discussing their available capability. And the Russians kind of calculate this ahead of what the Europeans are trying to do, and then they project what their response can be. But certainly they're sort of flexing the nuclear button from time to time, realizing that if Europe will come together and will try to front up Russia as a united force, obviously they would outgun and outnumber the Russians. And the only way how to equalize, in this sense, for the Russians is to bring in the nuclear dimension, initially tactical nuclear dimension, then potentially strategic nuclear dimension. But they also try to kind of make it very clear that they don't want the Europeans to push them towards that pathway, and they certainly don't want to escalate themselves, because then comes the question of demonstrating intent. One thing, you can kind of engage in some sort of political or verbal blackmail. Another thing, you actually demonstrate the real intent on the battlefield or through the decision-making process.
Right,
so
Alexey,
I think there is a degree of ambiguity.
Got it. Okay, and on this issue, I mean, you raised it earlier. You were talking about potential miscalculations. Just elaborate, if you may, on that briefly. And what do you think could be the main flashpoints if that were to happen?
Well, to me, one of the key flashpoints is the Gulf of Finland, where we saw a rapid reconfiguration of the geopolitical landscape with the admission of Finland into NATO. The fact that it continues to serve as one of Russia's exit points in terms of shipment of fossil fuels and other resources that the Russians try to sell. The very narrow physical nature of the area, and the fact that it saw a number of incidents ranging from violation of aerial airspace to a main incident when Russian fighter jet interjected in the boarding party attempt by the local authorities to seize control over one of the tankers that were destined towards Russia. So it is a matter of figuring out what the other side is doing as a result. If tensions running so high and muscles are shown, this is where you carry the risk of effectively someone pushing the trigger simply because they're thinking that the other side is taking a hostile action.
Okay, Eldar, you've argued that defense spending contains the conflict, but it doesn't resolve it. So what diplomatic track should the Europeans be pursuing?
Well, first of all, diplomatic connections with Moscow should be reestablished immediately. There are some leaders in the European Union and NATO who understand that, like Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and recently even the President of Poland, no friend of Russia by any means, has said that if Poland's national interest requires sitting down and talking with Vladimir Putin, he'd be ready to do that. So, and those diplomatic talks, first of all, of course, they should be directed towards putting an end towards the war in Ukraine. And that is because everything else that we're discussing, the drones, the incursions, the possible incidents in the Baltic Sea, the deep strike possibility inside Russia, all of these escalatory measures are a direct outcome and direct result of the war. And the longer the war goes on, the higher the possibility of miscalculation that could prove to be catastrophic. So, first of all, end the war in Ukraine. And second, there also must be an opening to discuss with Russia a future architecture of European security, because Russia...
But hang on a second, Eldar. Let me ask you this. I mean, look, Europe's threat perceptions seem to be very different, right? When you look at the Baltics, it seems to be an existential threat. But that threat from Russia is distant for countries like Spain or Portugal. So can the EU ever really come up with some sort of unified strategy under such divergent priorities?
Well, so far, the EU has done a remarkably good job in maintaining the line and adopting sanctions package after package, now 19. So even Hungary and Slovakia, who are, let's say, more skeptical countries, they played along. But there is a question to what extent this unity can be preserved if we are talking about escalatory scenarios that we were discussing. If the war in Ukraine really escalates with the kind of developments that haven't taken place up till now, such as deep strikes on, particularly on some symbolic targets in Russia, such as Kremlin, will that unity be preserved in the face of such escalation?
Okay.
And there's the question.
Let me bring in Mattia, because Mattia, you keep shaking your head. So tell us what you disagree with and just weigh in on your thoughts.
First of all, I want to say that the Ukrainians first and foremost want peace, and the Europeans are trying to put them in a position to sit down with the Russians, and no one is refusing to do that. But it's important to recognize what the Russian war aims are and why they haven't changed. You know, when Russians came to Kyiv in February 2022, they had kill lists of many of my friends. Had they been captured, the Russians would have simply assassinated those. So you need to understand that the Russian war aims are still the subjugation of all of Ukraine. If they can't do that militarily because they're bogged down in the Donbass, they will try to do that politically or through negotiations. So I'm saying that to preface that diplomacy is needed, but it should be done through a position of strength. So right now the Europeans are trying to put Ukraine in that position, and this is what we ought to focus on. How do we increase the cost for the Russian war efforts by helping Ukraine defend itself, and through economic means by freezing the assets and increasing the sanctions?
Okay, I'm going to come to the point of freezing the assets in a moment. But first, Mattia, just one more for you, because you raised the issue of position of strength. Some say that Russia is deliberately testing Europe to distract and divide. Do you see signs that those tests, if indeed Russia is doing that, are having an impact?
They do have an impact, but I wouldn't overestimate it as of now. I mean, I mentioned that I was in Denmark, a usually cool-headed society, and I really felt a palpable sense of unease that the airspace had to be closed, major airports had to be closed, and the military air bases where the country's most advanced fighter jets are positioned were, espionage by the Russians. So there was an unease, and they're testing it. They're testing us to divide ourselves in Europe. They're doing all their active measures, from espionage to sabotage to arson attacks to disinformation campaigns. So this is really to undermine our support for Ukraine and distract us. But what this summit shows, the European summit in Denmark, shows that there is still strong resolve, and the Russians haven't succeeded with their undermining of our Western support to Ukraine.
Alexey, EU leaders say that they're considering using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine, right? And fund Ukraine's construction. How do you think this is viewed in Moscow? Is this a red line, or is it just yet another type of sanction?
Well, I think the Russians are sort of in the state of mind that they almost accept that their assets that are frozen in Europe may never be returned to them. So this is where they kind of having their understanding. But at the same time, they kind of threaten a countermeasure, which is nationalizing Western-owned assets that continue to be in Russia. Some Western companies, some Western entities continue to operate in Russia. And what the Russians are saying, well, if you're going to take away our frozen assets, we will simply sell or acquire assets that belong to Western interests. And by that, we will try to create some sort of equalizer or perhaps inflict more economic loss on Western interests in terms of this ongoing tit-for-tat war and sanctions war that's been going on since 2022.
Eldar, would using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine risk further division, do you think, inside the EU, given that some members have been cautioning of the legality of this as well as sovereignty?
Well, the prospect of using those freeze assets for the purposes outlined are highly dubious because, first of all, they are located on the territory of a specific member state, which is Belgium, and they are deposited right now in the financial institution known as Euroclear, which means that assuming the war one day ends, then if Russia launches some kind of legal action, then Belgium would be the target of this action with potentially very negative consequences for the country's financial situation, and also from the point of view of credibility as a safe repository for assets. So Belgians are understandably reluctant to go down that path. But also the French President Macron also emphasized several times that this is a highly problematic step from legal point of view. And also I would like to add that diplomatically, this is one of the carrots or one of the bargaining chips that Europe could use in future negotiations with Russia.
Mattia, go ahead.
I think Europe cannot communicate to its voters that we have to continue supporting Ukraine while we sit on a war chest of Russian sovereign assets. And that's the first point. Second of all, if Russia retaliates by seizing private assets in Russia, that will cause international arbitrage. It's one thing to confiscate Russian sovereign wealth, but another to confiscate private property. So that would cause another type of response, and Russia will be held liable. When it comes to the Russian sovereign assets on European soil, Europeans have seemingly found a creative way of getting money without seizing the money outright. So I see a sea change. I see a change in the attitude of the French president. It's the leadership of the EU Commission president, the German leadership that is pushing this topic. And I think we will find a solution where Ukraine can get their hands on around 140 million euros to finance the war. And this sends a very strong signal to the Russians that we are in this to support Ukraine in the medium to long run. And this is very important. And Russia can challenge that legally, but let them. It's about finding a technical solution that is legally as sound as possible.
Look, Mattia, and I'm going to ask all of you the same question, in fact, as we come up to the end of the program. And that's what we started this program with. And are Russia and Europe moving closer to conflict? Mattia, go ahead.
I think Russia and Europe are already in a state of conflict. Mette Frederiksen said that we're in a hybrid war. Russia sees itself at war with the larger West. We have to remain cool-headed and understand that this war will only come to us in the form of tanks if we are too weak. The drones are already testing us, so we have to ramp up our defense, support Ukraine, and make sure that the war doesn't spill over from Ukraine any longer. And that runs through Ukraine, and Ukraine is centerpiece for that, so we have to help Ukraine to contain the Russians in Ukraine.
Eldar, what do you think? Are Russia and Europe moving closer to conflict? And what does this all mean for peace in Ukraine? Are we further away than ever?
If the escalation is going to proceed with such measures as deep strikes, blockade of Baltic ports, no-fly zone over Ukraine, then we'll definitely see more retaliatory actions from Russia. And then the question is, where does this escalation lead us? And the final ladder is a nuclear escalation. I would not underestimate that danger, which means that the only way to move away from the brink is to reestablish diplomatic channels, start dialogue with Russia, while at the same time, of course, continuing helping Ukraine and initiate discussions on European security architecture that would be inclusive and that would also obviously guarantee the security of Ukraine.
Alexey, final word to you. How do you see things moving forward?
Look, I mean, we need to accept that right now we don't see a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's the proxy conflict between Russia and the West over Ukraine, and Ukraine just happens to be the front line of Western defenses in Eastern Europe. And with presidency of Donald Trump, he has actually moved the conflict more to be more Eurocentric versus Russia rather than transatlantic versus Russia. Right now, I would describe the state of confrontation between Russia and Europe as controlled confrontation, controlled escalation, but there is an escalation ladder that continues to be exploited by both sides. And the question is whether that pattern of escalation remains controlled with a degree of predictability, or at some point in time, someone will slip off this ladder into uncontrolled escalation, which can also carry carry an unconventional or a nuclear dimension to it. So we're sort of in a gray zone in terms of trying to figure out where the direction of this confrontation goes. We certainly haven't reached the critical point. But the way how it unfolds right now, also with a lack of political will by both sides to de-escalate, to start having conversations, to start having discussions, which is a really pivotal because we're talking about confrontation between nuclear-armed nations. We need to remember that there are two nuclear-armed states in Europe, plus Russia being the nuclear superpower.
Right.
And that creates this degree of ambiguity and unpredictability in terms of strategic foresight.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you to all my guests for joining us, Mattia Nelles, Eldar Mamedov, and Alexey Muraviev. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks very much for watching, and bye-bye for now.